Hello and welcome to my retrospective? I haven't really decided what this is yet, but we'll call it a retrospective for now. My retrospective on the Medal of Honor games, a franchise that is very near and dear to my heart. So for those of you who aren't familiar with the Medal of Honor games, they're a series of first-person shooters that were largely created because of input from Steven Spielberg. The majority of the series takes place during the Second World War. It only deviated from that at the very end of its life cycle. The games would appear on consoles such as the original PlayStation, the Game Boy Advance, PCs, Macs, PlayStation 2, PlayStation 3, Xbox, GameCube, 360, Wii, PSP, and then now the most recent installment on Oculus VR. And so basically what this video is just me kind of taking a trip down memory lane and doing a bit of a retrospective on the series. This isn't a ranking or anything, but yeah, no, this is just me kind of going through the series and either talking a little bit about how I was exposed to the games or how these games meant to me growing up, and then also my perspective on some of the games that I've played more recently. So let's dive into things, and we'll start things off right with the first Medal of Honor game, which I played for the first time when I was in middle school on a used PlayStation 1 that I had bought from a pawn shop. It has a lot of PS1 and N64 era shooter growing pains, but it has an incredible atmosphere, a great sense of humor, and a score that makes it easy to overlook pretty much every other issue. I enjoyed the story and the characters. It's a really solid game, and I would strongly recommend picking it up if you're interested in dipping your toes into some old PlayStation 1 era shooter history. It's a fumble of a sentence if I've ever heard one. Obviously, it's not as polished and it's not as crisp as any modern shooter, so there's no way I'm going to sit here and be like, oh, it's just as good. But what I am trying to say is that for a game that came out in 1999, it's really advanced, it's really fun, and I can see how this kickstarted the franchise. Moving on to Medal of Honor Underground, this came out a year after the original game, and I have all the same pros and cons that I have with the first game. That being said, I think I like the story and the stealth missions more in this one over the first game. I don't know, I just... There was something about the stealth missions in the original Medal of Honor where there was just a part of me that really felt like they didn't work as well as they hoped. But in this one, I think that they work really well. I was really impressed at what they managed to pull off on a PlayStation 1. That being said, I was occasionally frustrated with the render distance, and I did experience some slowdown. And I think that anybody who's played this game will agree with this sentiment, is that shooting the Sten feels so fucking good. Every level that had the Sten, I would just be using that nonstop. It's so satisfying to shoot that. So all in all, Medal of Honor Underground I think is a slight improvement over the first game and the definitive Medal of Honor game on the PlayStation 1. It's a lot of fun. I have very little to say about Medal of Honor Underground for the Game Boy Advanced. I started feeling sick during the first level. It is quite possibly the ugliest game I have ever played. I'll give it that it was made to be played on a Game Boy Advance screen, and I was emulating it and had it blown up to fill my PC monitor, and I was getting motion sickness. It's virtually unplayable. I mean, like, it functions? And that's a bit of a stretch. It's terrible. I don't ever intend on playing it again, and I wouldn't recommend it to my worst enemy. Medal of Honor Allied Assault is the third game in the series. It came out in 2002 ahead of Frontline, but I didn't play it until much later in life. I actually didn't play it until about a year and a half ago, and I was pretty blown away by how well it held up. I just really love the level design. I think the controls feel great. I love the sound effects, the guns. This was a big deal for me because growing up, I was envious of people who had a gaming PC. You know, I wanted to play Medal of Honor Allied Assault so badly, and then when I finally had access to a gaming PC, the only one I had was Pacific Assault. I wasn't able to try anything else, and my entire life I was like, Allied Assault, I gotta get my hands on Allied Assault. Frontline is so good. Allied Assault is gonna be just as good as I remember Frontline being when I first played it. And while, yeah, I'll never have that, you know, nostalgic feeling, I'll never get that emotional connection that I have with the ones I played as a kid. I did really enjoy myself, and I debated whether or not I'd kind of talk about Spearhead and Breakthrough separately, but I'll just lump them all together because I played them back to back to back. I bought the, the War Chest collection, and I just played them all straight through, and honestly, they're fantastic games / DLC. I don't know, they're just really fun. I strongly recommend anybody give Allied Assault a try today. Yeah, it doesn't have all the bells and whistles that modern first-person shooters have, but just as a shooter, like a very bare-bones shooter, it's really crisp. I like old first-person shooters, and as far as like that kind of middle period between the, no looking up or down shooters of Doom and Wolfenstein, and then the modern era first-person shooters, that kind of mid-90s to mid-2000s chunk of first-person shooters, this is one of the best ones. Medal of Honor Frontline, my introduction to the series. I was really young when I played Frontline. I was probably actually pretty close to the game's launch on the GameCube. I think my dad got it for his birthday or something like that, and he just decided to let me play it. I think he just wanted somebody to play the multiplayer with. So the multiplayer is a lot of fun, especially on the GameCube or Xbox. If you could get 4 friends together and just play some GoldenEye style first-person shooting, is a lot of fun. I'll never forget how iconic that opening is, the D-Day level. I know a lot of people will talk about, Call of Duty 2's D-Day level or, Big Red 1's D-Day level. But for me, the D-Day level that I think of when people say D-Day levels in video games, I think of Medal of Honor Frontline. I think the voice acting is stupendous. I think the sound design is stupendous. I think the gameplay holds up really well despite being on old hardware. I love the art style. I love the tone. I love the atmosphere. I just really love this game. It's still fun for me to replay it, and I admit I have a lot of nostalgia for it. But even replaying it today, I just think that there's something about Frontline that feels more buttery smooth than something that has aged better. I can't quite put my finger on it. Moving on, I just think it's amazing at capturing many different moods. I know that the levels where you're in the Netherlands, they feel so somber, and there's a sadness in the music that I find really encapsulating. And then when it gets really amped up and action-packed towards the end, I'm just hooked as ever, like just as invested as I was when I was a kid. I really love Medal of Honor Frontline, and the PS3 remake is a really solid remake. So if you want to play it, but you're not really wanting to go back and play it on a PS2, original Xbox, or GameCube, you can still get it on the PS3 shop today. Moving on to my second Medal of Honor game as a kid, Medal of Honor Rising Sun. I think that this game, it's okay. My fondest memories of this are pulling all-nighters and playing through the campaign in co-op mode with my friends. The game, I think, has a little bit more slowdown. Maybe it doesn't run as well as Frontline, and maybe that's just because there's so much jam-packed into it, and having it on the GameCube, it just couldn't handle it. I don't know, maybe the PS2 and Xbox versions are much better, but I had it on the GameCube, and I definitely remember there being some hiccups. It's a solid enough game. It ends on a cliffhanger, which was really frustrating for me. I remember playing through it and thinking, well, if I do this, I'll get the real ending, and it's just some bullshit I made up in my head. The opening level, at least for me, the opening level where you're in the assault on Pearl Harbor, to me is as iconic as the D-Day mission in Frontline. When the Arizona gets sunk, I remember being washed with like shock and awe. I also like and appreciate that it differentiates itself from the rest of the franchise, in Pacific Assault at least, by being set in the Pacific Theater. It's a really solid game, and I do like the level variety. You got jungle levels, you got the Pearl Harbor opening, cities, the Singapore level. So you've got all sorts of stuff. It keeps the game fresh. Something that I think the early Medal of Honor games were really good at is keeping the visual variety fresh. Medal of Honor Infiltrator is a top-down shooter for the Game Boy Advance. I actually had a lot of fun playing it. I just found the gameplay really addicting. I really liked the art style. I liked the music. I just really liked this game. It's not amazing by any stretch of the imagination, and it definitely is a bit of a black sheep in the Medal of Honor franchise, but I had a good time with it. I would definitely recommend playing it if you haven't. I used an emulator to play it. Even though I didn't grow up with this game, it kind of gave me that feeling of nostalgia. A lot of Game Boy Advance games do. It's just like the way that they looked and sounded. I don't know. But yeah, it was a lot of fun. I was surprised. When I was young, I was really blown away by the graphics and the quote-unquote realism, but after playing it for a little while, I stopped and hadn't touched it in almost 15 years. Revisiting it, I found a shooter that mechanically feels good. The controls were responsive, the shooting feels good, it's ambitious, and it's innovative, but its shortcomings keep it from being great. My first major issue is that despite feeling good to control, the feeling of goodness is occasionally interrupted by an incredibly glitchy experience. Several times I'd be meleeed to death through a wall. An enemy soldier would pop out of thin air and one-shot me, and my medic just wouldn't heal me. The graphics haven't aged great, and it's at this point that I'd like to make my biggest complaint. Despite the Medal of Honor series' bread and butter being Spielberg-y, almost Bond-esque plots where one man wins the war, this game goes for an almost simulation approach. An interesting idea, but one that's not executed well. I played on the realism mode, and what I found incredibly frustrating is that for a realism mode, it's not very realistic. I won't ding it too much, because, it's a game from 2004, but I was hoping for enemies to drop after like one bullet. I was hoping for things like suppressing fire to matter, and for ammo conservation to be a factor. In reality, the realism mode is just harder mode. This attempt at realism is ultimately the biggest hindrance in the game. Going back to the graphics, Medal of Honor Frontline and Allied Assault have a much more slightly stylized look, and they frankly hold up much better. This game went for a more realistic look, and it hasn't aged as gracefully. And another ding against this game, again kind of tied into the realism approach, is that the tone of the game is all over the place. It's honestly having a major identity crisis. It bounces from levels like Pearl Harbor, where you've got cutscenes that are very war is hell, and it's very serious, and it's taking itself very seriously. And then the dialogue bounces to the much more traditional, lighter Medal of Honor tone that feels more fun. It's very jarring. The music is also lacking. Medal of Honor has so many iconic tracks, and in the rest of the franchise, the music complements the action super well. There is so much fucking silence in this game. Just gunfire and the glitchy popping of an airplane or jungle sound effect. The voice acting, I will say, however, was top-notch. The weapon variety feels kind of lacking, and frankly, the only guns I found worth using were the Thompson, M1 Garand, carbine, and occasionally I'd use the Japanese sniper rifle. The shotgun was possibly the most pathetic shotgun in all of gaming. I can't think of another game where I actively avoided the shotgun. Normally that's like my go-to, but in this one it was like, oh fuck, I'm out of ammo, and my only option is a shotgun. I guess I'll try melee. There's a good level variety that keeps the game fresh. Overall, it's a mixed bag. It's not totally bad, but it's just not to the standard that you'd want. European Assault. I had this for the GameCube as well, and I think I also had it for the PS2 at a different point in time. It's another Medal of Honor game. I think this one kind of blends into the pack. I don't remember it having any of those like really iconic moments that are in Frontline or Rising Sun or even the original Medal of Honor. To me, this is just, oh yeah, it's that Medal of Honor game. I don't know. I wish I had more to say. It's funny that I actually have more to say about the ones that I played as an adult, whereas this one you'd think I'd have like a deep amount of nostalgia for it, but I really don't. I just was like, yeah, well, it was fine, it was good, it was another Medal of Honor. But when I was young, when these games were coming out, I'd honestly just replay Frontline and Rising Sun over and over again. Not that makes European Assault bad. I think it's on par with those games in most categories, but I think it is missing something. Medal of Honor Heroes 1, or just Medal of Honor Heroes, is a PSP game, and if I'm going to be completely honest with you, I've never owned this one, and I've never beaten this one. The only time I've ever played Heroes was on displays at like Superstore and Walmart. They had the little kiosk that have like a PSP bolted to the wall, basically. Played Heroes on one of those, and then I also had a friend who had a PSP with Heroes on it, so I have played it enough that I feel like I can say a bit about it, but not enough that I'm going to really do a deep dive. I think it's pretty good. That being said, I think it, lacks in comparison to the rest of the series. I'd say it's close to being the best of the mobile games, which isn't saying much. But yeah, I just don't have much to say about Heroes, just because my experience with it is pretty limited in comparison to the rest of the series. It's serviceable, and if you have a PSP and want to collect up a decent library of games, I'd say Heroes is worth grabbing. Certainly better than Heroes 2 on the Wii. In direct contrast to European Assault, Medal of Honor Vanguard is actually one that I have a ton of nostalgia for. And I probably got them around the same time. I mean, they came out a year apart, and I still bought GameCube games well into my Wii collecting phase when the Wii came out. So I think I was probably playing European Assault on my Wii and then switching over to Vanguard. But I actually have much fonder memories of Vanguard, and I think a lot of that has to do with the presentation and how well done the motion controls were. I know that there's a lot of people who think that the Wii is actually great for first-person shooters, like control-wise. Yes, it didn't have the power to really play really big, grand first-person shooters. It couldn't handle Call of Duty in their truest form, like Call of Duty 4 Reflex Edition on the Wii visually pales in comparison to the PS3. I think that goes without saying. But first-person shooters that were made for the Wii, or with the Wii specifically in mind, I think have aged really well. Vanguard being one of them. I just really love jumping out of the airplane airplanes. I think that this is one of the last Medal of Honor games that really captures that Spielberg-y feel. It's just really fun. I've played through it twice, and I plan on doing it again. It's just a really good game. Alright, moving on to Medal of Honor Airborne, which came out in 2007. They were close. Lots of cool ideas here. I like the openness that you can approach the mission objectives. I like the upgrading weapons. I like the weapon variety. Jumping out of planes is fun. The voice acting and music are good. I think it lacks in some key areas though. For instance, the controls aren't as buttery smooth in this game as they are in games like Call of Duty or Halo. The campaign is pathetic in length. It is way too short. That being said, it's overall pretty fun and a pretty underrated game. The enemy AI is decent, and all the guns except the sniper rifles feel great. Sound design is top-notch, the graphics are solid for the time, and while the campaign is short, it's okay otherwise. Speaking of the campaign, man, Medal of Honor lost its identity pretty quick. I really feel like the first batch of games, they all feel they're a part of the same series. I mean, hell, even Infiltrator fits pretty good. It's just the tone and the atmosphere are consistent in those games. They successfully capture somber moments while also managing to have moments of comedy. The action is fast-paced, and the games follow a one-man versus the world formula. While I'd say that the series fully loses its way in the Wii, PS3, 360 era, Pacific Assault already had the warning signs of things to come. That game had a bit of an identity crisis and tries to be more of a squad sim, but it couldn't fully let go of the Spielberg-y roots. But once we're playing games on the PS3, Wii, and 360, you get a weird hodgepodge of traditional games like Vanguard, which feel very traditional Medal of Honor, but then you get Airborne, which feels like it really wants to be Call of Duty 3, and then you got the Heroes games, which feel very vanilla World War II first-person shooter game, and then the last two, which try really hard to be Battlefield. So just to wrap things up about Airborne, it's a really solid game. It's just got those big hiccups that I think hold it back from being a classic. I do want to say before getting into talking about Medal of Honor Heroes 2 that I only ever played the Wii version, so I can't really speak to how the PSP version holds up. I didn't finish it, I'll start with that. I might come back and finish this one later, and I might specifically play it on the rail shooter mode, but for now I think I'm finished with it. The lack of music and the really linear levels make for a really boring experience, and don't get me wrong, linear levels aren't automatically bad, but this game lacks the cinematic quality that makes many linear first-person shooter games work. The motion controls range from, hey, that's kinda cool, to, holy fuck, can we move on already? It's crazy that this game is in the same series as Frontline and Allied Assault. Those games have such a good aesthetic and good level design, and not to mention the mood and atmosphere in those Medal of Honor games is top notch. The only thing that reminds you that this is a Medal of Honor game is the occasional soundbite and the basic art design. The gun sounds and ambient audio are good, the controls work enough, and the voice acting is well done. This game has pluses, but they're very few and far between. I just think that if you're gonna make a more linear game, you really have to deliver on the cinematic nature of the experience. Like, some of the more linear Call of Duty games do a fantastic job of creating these really big set pieces that are fun to walk through and witness, and this game just doesn't have that. And now that we're on to the 2010 game, let's just rip the band-aid off. This is not a Medal of Honor game. I mean, it is in name and in one legacy character in a supporting role, but there is nothing else about this that feels even remotely Medal of Honor. The tone, score, soundtrack, atmosphere, sense of humor, and style of story are completely different than anything they attempted in the series before. This game wants to be a hybrid of Battlefield and Call of Duty so badly. Now that that's out of the way, how is the game? It's generic, but solid. The voice acting, production value, and graphics for its time are top fucking notch. Compared to Airborne, this game controls a lot better, but like Airborne, it feels incredibly short. I beat it in one sitting. This game reeks of propaganda, and it feels like it's trying so goddamn hard to be cool, it's just kind of cringy. I remember there was like an ad campaign, and I might be misremembering this, but there was an ad campaign that really kind of wanted to sell that this is what it's like to be these guys in Afghanistan. And I mean, maybe it's true, but the way that the game portrays it kind of came off as, like I said, cringe. I think despite the shortness of the campaign, there is a decent variety of gameplay. There's driving sections, like pseudo on-rail sections, traditional sections, and stealth sections. I will say, though, that I do miss so much the espionage elements of the early Medal of Honor games. I would kill to be walking around with a pamphlet or identity papers and showing them to Nazis or Afghanis, I guess, in this game, and just doing the stealth thing. Like, I really like that about the early games. And it's still, when you go back and you play the original first two Medal of Honors, those elements, they made it feel very unique in contrast to the early Call of Duty games or the early, Halo games. It's an above average game that came out at a time where it needed to be so much more than above average to even compete, but it's really not that bad. And I think that if you're into these kind of first person shooters, that this one's worth checking out. Moving on to Warfighter, while this game does share many of the same positives as the previous game, it also shares all its negatives and then adds some. I had a pretty glitchy experience with it. I had a few instances where I actually had to completely restart levels because an NPC would get stuck and I wouldn't be able to open a door or progress. The facial animations are whack. They completely ruin some of the game's dramatic sections. Not that the dramatic sections were going to be effective anyways, the story isn't interesting, and on top of that, it's told poorly. The guns feel good to shoot, but I was disappointed by the variety. There's a solid variety in the gameplay, thankfully. There's sniping and stealth missions and driving levels, etc. The graphics, again, are impressive for the time, but I can't say I like the art style. It's abundantly clear that EA wanted this to be their Call of Duty Modern Warfare trilogy super bad, but the writers lack the storytelling ability to pull it off. Once again, it feels like it's trying way too hard to be cool, and it's embarrassing. There's good stuff here like its predecessor, but there's so much more hindrances that it makes it fall short. And now I just really want to briefly touch on Medal of Honor Above and Beyond, just before I end the video. I don't really have too much to say about it because I don't own any sort of VR headset, so I haven't actually played it. I've seen quite a bit of footage of it online, and it looks interesting, but that seems to be about it. From what I've heard, it's not that great. It's got a lot of problems, but it is interesting just in what it is. So I don't have much to add. I hope that one day I get the opportunity to play it, and then I can be really cool and say that I've played every Medal of Honor game like a really cool guy. And with that, I think we wrap things up. Thanks for watching, especially if you've made it this far into the video. I realize that a lot of this is kind of just me rambling about games that I remember fondly or have just recently kind of played for the first time, but always wanted to try. Yeah, do whatever you want, like and subscribe.